The room fell quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, like even the air itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Crystal chandeliers glowed above a sea of expensive suits and silk dresses, the kind of room where people didn't look twice at anyone who didn't belong. And yet, every single eye was now locked on him. A janitor, sitting at a grand piano that probably cost more than everything he owned. His uniform was still on, slightly wrinkled, faint stains on the sleeves, his name tag crooked. You could almost hear the judgment before anyone spoke. Then Veronica, the CEO, leaned forward with a smile that wasn't entirely kind and said, "If you can play Frédéric Chopin, I'll marry you." The room burst into laughter, sharp and dismissive. His fingers hovered above the keys. They were trembling just slightly, not enough for everyone to notice but enough to tell a different story. A story no one in that room had the patience to imagine. People whispered. Some took out their phones, already expecting embarrassment, already ready to share the moment online. But then there was something else, a stillness in his posture, a quiet that didn't match the laughter around him. And in that silence something felt off. Because moments like this don't just happen, not by accident, not without a past. Everyone thought he was a joke. A man out of place, reaching too far, about to humiliate himself in front of people who had spent their lives proving they belonged in rooms like this. But what they didn't know was that this moment was 15 years in the making. 15 years of choices, losses, and quiet endurance that no one in that ballroom could see. And as his fingers finally lowered toward the keys, there was a single question hanging in the air, one no one there thought to ask. What if they were wrong about him? Cut to black. Because this janitor was who they thought he was. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The first note hadn't even been played yet and already something about the room had shifted. Have you ever been in a moment like that, when everyone around you is so certain about who you are and they're completely wrong, when the weight of people's assumptions feels heavier than anything you've actually done? Because that's where this story really begins, not in that ballroom, not with the laughter, but 15 years earlier, in a small apartment that smelled faintly of old wood and coffee that had been reheated too many times. 15 years earlier, he wasn't a janitor. He was a boy sitting at an upright piano with chipped ivory keys, his mother standing behind him with her arms folded, listening carefully. "Again," she said softly. He sighed, frustrated, his fingers slipping over the notes. "I'm trying," he muttered. She stepped closer, placing her hand gently over his. "No," she whispered, "you're rushing, feel it." That word stayed with him. Feel it, not just play the notes, not just get through it, feel it. The room was small, the walls thin, the kind where you could hear neighbors arguing or laughing through the night. But when he played, everything else disappeared. His mother worked 2 jobs, morning shifts at a diner, evenings cleaning offices downtown. She was always tired but never too tired to listen. Never too tired to correct him, to guide him, to remind him that music wasn't just sound, it was memory, emotion, truth. "One day," she told him once, sitting beside him on the bench, "you'll play somewhere people will stop and listen." He laughed at the idea. It felt too far away, too unrealistic for a kid who wore second-hand shoes and counted coins before buying anything. But she didn't laugh. She believed it in a way that made him want to believe it too. And then everything changed. It was winter, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. He came home from school to a quiet apartment, too quiet, no music playing, no smell of food, just silence. He called out for her once, then again, his voice echoing slightly off the walls. When he found her, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, one hand pressed against her chest, her breathing uneven. "Mom," his voice cracked. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's okay," she whispered, though it clearly was. That was the last full conversation they ever had. Weeks later, the piano was still there, but the apartment felt different, empty in a way that couldn't be filled. He stopped playing, not because he didn't want to, but because every note reminded him of her voice, correcting him, encouraging him, believing in him. And without her, it felt pointless. Life moved on the way it always does, even when you don't want it to. Bills piled up. Responsibilities came faster than he was ready for. Dreams slowly got quieter. "So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have kept playing? Would you have held onto something that reminded you of someone you lost, or would you have let it go just to survive?" Years passed. He took whatever jobs he could find: construction, deliveries, night shifts, the kind of work that leaves your hands rough and your body exhausted. Music became something distant, something he avoided. Until one night, almost by accident, he heard it again. A piano, soft, distant, coming from an open window as he walked past a building downtown. He stopped, just for a moment, just long enough for something inside him to shift. The notes weren't perfect, but they were real. And for the first time in years, he felt something again. That building would later become the same luxury hotel where everything would come full circle. But at that moment, it was just a place with an open window and a sound he couldn't ignore. 6 months later, he applied for a job there, not as a musician, not even close, as a janitor. It was stable, it paid enough, and it gave him something he didn't expect: access. Late at night, when the halls were empty and the lights were dimmed, he would pass by the ballroom, the same grand piano. At first he only looked, then one night he sat down. His fingers hesitated, just like they would years later, but this time there was no audience, no laughter, just him and the memory of a voice telling him to feel it. The first note echoed softly through the empty room, then another, and another, until something long buried began to come back to life. Night after night he returned, quietly, carefully, playing when no one was watching, relearning what he had once known, fixing mistakes, starting over, sometimes stopping halfway through because the memories became too heavy, but always coming back, always trying again. 15 years, that's how long it took to go from that small apartment to that ballroom filled with people who had already decided who he was. And now, sitting at that piano with laughter still lingering in the air, he pressed the first key. The sound that followed didn't match what anyone expected. It was precise, controlled, deep, the kind of sound that makes people stop without knowing why. Conversations faded, smiles slowly disappeared. One by one, heads turned, not out of curiosity anymore, but something closer to disbelief. His hands moved with a confidence that didn't belong to a man who had just been laughed at. And in that moment, everything changed. So ask yourself this: how many times have you looked at someone and assumed you knew their story? How many times have you dismissed someone because they didn't fit the image you had in your mind? And what if just once you were completely wrong? By the time most people in that ballroom learned his name, they had already decided what it meant. Daniel Reyes, mid-30s, quiet. The kind of man who moved through rooms without leaving an impression, except for the faint squeak of a cleaning cartwheel that never seemed to roll quite right. He kept his head down, nodded when spoken to, and rarely stayed long enough in one place to invite conversation. To the guests, he was invisible. To the staff, he was unusual, not rude, not unfriendly, just distant, like someone who had learned a long time ago that speaking less made life easier. Veronica Hale, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. She carried authority the way some people carried perfume, strong, unmistakable, and lingering long after she left the room. Every decision, every glance, every word she spoke seemed measured and deliberate. People admired her, feared her, and tried not to disappoint her. She had built her reputation on precision, on control, on never being wrong about people. And that was why when she looked at Daniel, she didn't see possibility. She saw exactly what she expected to see: a man far removed from the world she operated in. The hotel itself was a place designed to impress: polished marble floors, towering glass windows reflecting city lights, and a constant hum of quiet luxury. The kind of place where deals were made over soft laughter and expensive wine, where reputations were built in a single evening. That night's gala was no different: high-profile guests, influential names, everyone there had something to prove or something to gain. And in the middle of it all, moving quietly between tables and corners, was Daniel, collecting empty glasses, wiping unnoticed spills, existing on the edges of a world that didn't make space for him. But if you listen closely, not to the guests but to the staff, you'd hear something else. Small whispers exchanged during short breaks, glances shared when Daniel walked past. "He barely speaks," one of them said quietly, watching him disappear down a hallway. Another shrugged, lowering their voice. "Yeah, but have you noticed, he's always here late, even when his shift ends." There was no accusation in their tone, just curiosity, the kind that builds slowly when something doesn't quite add up. Because every night after the last guest had left, after the lights were dimmed and the echoes of laughter faded into silence, something strange happened. At first it was easy to dismiss. A security guard mentioned hearing piano music long after closing hours. Soft, careful, almost hesitant. Management assumed it was a glitch in the sound system or maybe someone forgetting to turn something off. But then it happened again, and again, always around the same time, always coming from the same place: the ballroom. One night a housekeeper paused outside the doors, her hand hovering over the handle. The music was clearer this time, not random notes, not noise, a melody, slow, deliberate, filled with something she couldn't quite explain. She frowned, glancing down the empty hallway. "Hello," she called softly, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was dark, empty, the piano untouched. The sound had stopped the moment she entered. She told the others the next morning, her voice half serious, half nervous. Some laughed it off, others didn't. "Old buildings make noise," someone said, "probably pipes or wiring." But the explanation didn't sit right. Pipes don't play melodies, wiring doesn't pause when you open a door. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, a quiet question began to form. If no one was there, then who was playing? Daniel never reacted to these conversations. If he heard them, he gave no sign. He continued his routine exactly the same way. Clock in, work quietly, leave or at least appear to leave. No one ever saw him linger. no one ever saw him near the piano, and yet, the music continued. Have you ever noticed something that didn't make sense but everyone around you chose to ignore it? Something small, almost easy to dismiss, until it kept happening over and over again, because that's how it starts. Not with answers, just with questions that refuse to go away. 3 months before that gala, a new night security officer decided to take a closer look. He had heard the stories, dismissed them at first, but curiosity has a way of growing when the nights get long and quiet. Around 2:15 a.m., he positioned himself near the end of the hallway leading to the ballroom, lights dimmed, footsteps careful. He waited. Minutes passed. Then, just when the silence felt complete, it started again. A single note, then another. The officer's breath slowed as he moved closer, each step deliberate. The sound grew clearer, richer, filling the empty corridor with something that didn't belong in a place that should have been asleep. He reached the door, hesitated for just a second, then pushed it open. And just like that, silence. The room was empty, no movement, no one at the piano, just the faint echo of the last note still hanging in the air as if it hadn't fully decided to leave. He stepped inside, scanning every corner, every shadow, nothing. But then he noticed something small, the piano bench slightly out of place, not enough for most people to notice, but enough to suggest it had been used recently. The next morning, he reported it. Management listened, nodded, and moved on. There were more important things to focus on, bigger priorities, the kind that didn't involve chasing sounds in the middle of the night. But the story didn't disappear. If anything, it spread, quietly, carefully, just enough to keep people wondering. And all the while Daniel kept working, silent, unbothered, present but never fully seen. So let me ask you this, if you were there, hearing those stories, seeing those small details that didn't quite fit, would you have connected the dots? Or would you have done what everyone else did and looked right past the one person who didn't seem important enough to question? Because sometimes the biggest mysteries aren't hidden. They're simply ignored. By the time the clock passed midnight, the hotel became a different world. The laughter was gone, the music replaced by silence. Even the air felt still, like the building itself was finally allowed to rest. That was when Daniel's shift slowed down, fewer footsteps in the hallways, fewer eyes watching, just the quiet rhythm of routine: wipe, collect, move on. But on certain nights when his cart rolled past the ballroom doors, something changed, not outside, inside him. The grand piano sat there, covered, protected like something valuable that no one wanted touched. Daniel paused beside it longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the cloth. He didn't move right away, instead he listened, not for sound but for permission. The hallway behind him was empty, no voices, no footsteps, just silence. Slowly he pulled the cover back, careful not to let it make a sound. The polished surface underneath reflected the dim lights above, almost like it had been waiting. He looked around once more, then he sat. There was hesitation at first, the kind that comes from memory, not doubt. His fingers hovered above the keys just like they had in that ballroom, just like they had years ago in a much smaller room, and then he pressed the first note. The sound was soft, but it carried. It filled the empty hall in a way that felt almost personal, like it wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. Then another note followed, and another, until the melody began to take shape, delicate, controlled, unmistakably intentional. This wasn't someone guessing, this wasn't someone trying their luck, this was something else entirely. It was mastery. The music of Frédéric Chopin moved through the room with quiet precision, each note placed exactly where it belonged. There was no rush, no hesitation anymore, just emotion carefully held together by years of discipline. If you had walked in at that moment, you wouldn't have seen a janitor, you would have seen something completely different, someone completely different. And yet no one ever saw it. But pieces of the truth had always been there, hidden, fragmented, waiting to be noticed. A glimpse of bright stage lights. A younger version of Daniel standing at a grand piano, his posture straighter, his expression focused in a way that only comes from years of preparation. The sound of applause, loud, overwhelming, echoing through a concert hall filled with people who had come specifically to hear him play. Hands coming together, rising to their feet. A standing ovation, not out of politeness but respect. He bows slightly, controlled, trained. Then the image fades. Back to the empty ballroom, back to the quiet, back to a man no one looks at twice. How does someone go from that to this? That's the question no one in that hotel was asking, because no one had seen both sides. No one had connected the man cleaning the floors to the person who once stood under stage lights commanding a room without saying a word, and maybe that's what made it easier to overlook him, easier to assume there was nothing more to see. But the music told a different story. There were moments, subtle but impossible to fake, where something deeper slipped through. A slight pause before a difficult passage, a shift in tempo that carried emotion instead of precision. The kind of details that only come from experience, from loss, from something that changes the way you hear the world. This wasn't just performance, it was memory. It was everything he hadn't said out loud in years. Have you ever hidden a part of yourself so completely that people stopped expecting it from you? Maybe even forgot it was there? Something you were once proud of, something that defined you until life slowly pushed it aside? Because that's what this felt like. Not a secret meant to impress anyone, just something too important to let go of, even if no one else ever saw it. Night after night, Daniel returned to that piano, not every shift, not every week, but enough that the routine became something more than coincidence. He never stayed long, never played loudly, always stopping at the slightest sound from the hallway. It wasn't fear that drove that caution, it was understanding. Some things aren't meant to be explained, not yet. But the question remained. What happened to him, and why did he disappear? Because people don't just walk away from something like that, not without a reason, not without something powerful enough to pull them in a completely different direction. And if you were standing in that empty ballroom, hearing that music echo through the silence, would you have recognized what it really meant? Would you have heard the years behind it, the loss, the discipline? Or would you have done what everyone else did and missed it entirely? It happened on a night that felt no different from the others. The same quiet hallways, the same dim lights, the same routine that Daniel had followed for months without interruption. He had finished most of his work early, the last few tasks scattered across floors that no longer echoed with footsteps. And like before, without announcing it to anyone, he found himself standing in front of the ballroom doors again. Inside, the piano waited. He stepped in slowly, closing the door just enough to keep the silence contained. The cover came off with careful hands, folded neatly to the side like a habit he had repeated countless times. He sat down, exhaled quietly, and let his fingers rest on the keys. There was no hesitation this time, no pause to think, just the music. The first notes of Frédéric Chopin rose gently into the empty space, filling it with something soft, controlled, and deeply personal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be. It was the kind of playing that didn't demand attention but held it completely if you happened to hear it. And someone did. The sound reached the hallway just as Veronica was passing by, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She stopped, not immediately, just enough for the rhythm of her steps to break. At first it didn't make sense. Music at this hour? She turned slightly, listening more carefully. The notes were clear, intentional, not background noise, not a recording. Someone was playing. She walked toward the ballroom doors, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something more focused. She didn't knock, she didn't hesitate, she pushed the door open. And there he was. Daniel didn't notice her at first. He was too focused, too lost in the flow of the piece to register the change in the room, but the music stopped the second her presence settled into the space, not abruptly, not clumsily, just ended. His hands rested on the keys for a moment longer before he slowly looked up. There was a brief silence. Then a slow clap. The sound echoed in the empty ballroom, deliberate and sharp. Veronica stepped forward, her expression unreadable at first, then shifting into something closer to amusement. "A janitor," she said, her voice calm but carrying easily through the room, playing Chopin. Daniel didn't respond, he just looked at her, not defensive, not apologetic, just still. By then, the noise had drawn attention. A couple of staff members passing by paused at the doorway. One of them leaned in, then another. Word traveled quickly, the way it always does in places like that. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, staff, a few late-staying guests, all drawn by the same curiosity. Veronica glanced around, noticing the attention, and something in her posture shifted. She wasn't just observing anymore, she was performing. "Well," she continued, tilting her head slightly, "this is unexpected." A faint smirk formed, subtle but intentional. "Tell you what," she said, stepping closer to the piano, her eyes fixed on Daniel. "If you can play it properly tonight in front of everyone." She paused, just long enough for the room to lean in. "And I'll marry you." For a split second there was silence, then the room erupted in laughter, not hesitant, not unsure, full, confident laughter that filled every corner of the space. Some people shook their heads, others covered their mouths, a few whispered comments to each other, already turning the moment into a story they'd retell later. To them it was obvious, a joke, a harmless bit of entertainment at someone else's expense. But Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't look embarrassed either, he didn't argue, he didn't try to explain himself. He just sat there, his hands now resting in his lap, his eyes fixed on Veronica, not with anger, not with fear, just a quiet, steady look that didn't match the noise around him. Have you ever been in a moment where everyone else is laughing and you're the only one who understands what's really happening, where people think they're watching something small but it means something much bigger to you? Because that's what this was, not just a joke, not just a challenge, something else entirely had just been set in motion. The laughter slowly faded, replaced by scattered conversations as people began to move on, already losing interest now that the moment had peaked. Veronica gave one last amused glance as if she had already decided the outcome, then turned to leave. To her it was over, a brief interruption, nothing more. But as the room emptied and the noise disappeared, Daniel remained seated at the piano, still, silent. His expression hadn't changed. If anything, it had settled into something more focused, more certain. Because what she didn't realize was who she had just challenged. Long before anyone in that hotel ever saw Daniel Reyes in a janitor's uniform, there was another version of him. One that existed under bright lights in rooms where silence meant respect, not indifference. Back then his name carried weight. Not fame in the way people chase it today, but recognition, the kind that spreads quietly among those who understand what they're hearing. Teachers spoke about him in careful tones. Critics wrote about him with restraint, as if they didn't want to exaggerate what was already undeniable. He was a prodigy. Not the kind shaped by shortcuts or shortcuts disguised as talent, but the kind built through years of discipline layered on something rare and difficult to explain. By the time he was in his late teens, he had already been accepted into one of the most selective conservatories in the country. A place where excellence wasn't encouraged, it was expected, and even there he stood out. "Watch his phrasing," one instructor whispered during a closed rehearsal, arms folded as Daniel played. "He doesn't just follow the music, he understands it." Another shook their heads slightly, almost in disbelief. "He reminds me of the old masters, there's patience in his playing, control." These weren't compliments given lightly, they were observations, careful, measured, and rare. And Daniel, he never reacted to them, not outwardly. He would finish a piece, stand, give a small nod, and step away from the piano as if it were just another day. But inside, something deeper was forming, not pride, not pressure, something closer to purpose. Because for him, music wasn't a path to success, it was connection, to memory, to meaning, to the one person who had been there from the beginning. His mother. She sat in the front row of nearly every performance she could attend, her posture slightly forward, hands resting in her lap, eyes never leaving him once he began to play. She didn't clap the loudest. She didn't need to, the way she looked at him said everything. After one performance, as people gathered around him with congratulations and questions, she waited until the crowd thinned. Then she stepped closer, smiling softly. "You felt it tonight," she said. He nodded just once. "I did." That was enough. But life doesn't pause just because something is going right. The night everything changed wasn't dramatic in the way people expect. There were no warning signs that stood out in hindsight, no clear moment where things could have been stopped, just a series of ordinary events that led to something irreversible. It was late. Daniel had stayed behind at the conservatory longer than usual, practicing a difficult section he refused to leave unfinished. His phone had buzzed once, then stopped. He didn't check it, not right away. When he finally did, there were missed calls, messages, short, urgent. By the time he arrived, the street was filled with flashing lights. Red, blue, reflections bouncing off nearby windows, people gathered at a distance, voices low, uncertain. He pushed through them, his breath uneven, his mind trying to catch up with what he was seeing. His building was surrounded. Smoke still hung in the air, faint but unmistakable. "Sir, you can't go in there," someone said, stepping in front of him. "My mother," he managed, his voice barely holding together. "She's inside." The response came too quickly, too rehearsed. "I'm sorry." There are moments in life that don't feel real when they happen, moments where the world continues moving but something inside you stops completely. This was one of them. The noise around him blurred, the voices became distant, and all that remained was a single, unbearable truth settling in. She wasn't coming back. Weeks later, Daniel returned to the piano, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know what else to do. The stage felt different now, larger, colder, the lights harsher than he remembered. The audience sat quietly, waiting, unaware of what had changed. To them, it was just another performance, another opportunity to hear someone they had come to admire. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and for a moment nothing happened. Then he began. The first few notes were steady, controlled, familiar, but something underneath them had shifted. The connection he once felt, the one that made everything else disappear, was gone, replaced by something heavier. Each note carried memory, not expression. Each pause felt longer than it should, and then halfway through the piece his hands stopped. Completely. The silence that followed wasn't respectful anymore, it was uncertain, confused. He stared at the keys, his breathing uneven, his thoughts no longer aligned with the music in front of him. Someone in the audience shifted. Another whispered, but Daniel didn't move. He couldn't. After a few seconds that felt much longer, he stood up. No bow, no explanation, just turned and walked off the stage. That was the last time most people ever saw him perform. The reviews the next day were careful but clear. Words like unexpected, concerning, uncharacteristic. Speculation filled the spaces where answers didn't exist. Some assumed pressure, others assumed burnout. A few guessed something more personal, but no one really knew. And then he disappeared. No announcements, no farewell performance, no return. His name slowly faded from conversations, replaced by new talent, new stories, new expectations. The world of music moved on the way it always does. But Daniel didn't move on, not in the same way. Because he didn't just lose his career, he lost his reason to play. So let me ask you this: if the one thing that gave your life meaning suddenly became a reminder of everything you lost, would you keep going? Would you fight through it even when it hurts to face it? Or would you walk away the way he did and never look back? Because for Daniel, walking away wasn't a decision made in a single moment. It was something that happened slowly, piece by piece, until the life he once knew no longer felt like it belonged to him. And yet somehow the music never fully left. The challenge should have meant nothing, just a careless remark in a room full of people who had already moved on. By the next morning, most of them had forgotten it entirely, folding it into the kind of story that gets retold for a day or two before disappearing. But for Daniel, it didn't disappear, it stayed, quietly, persistently. That night, he didn't go near the ballroom. He worked faster than usual, moving through his tasks with a precision that left no room for distraction. Tables cleared before anyone noticed they were empty. Floors cleaned before anyone stepped back into the space. If there was a path that avoided the piano, he took it. If there was a reason to stay busy, he found it. To anyone watching, nothing seemed different. He was just doing his job, the same way he always had. But something had changed. Because silence, when you're trying to avoid something, doesn't feel the same anymore. It becomes louder, more noticeable. Every hallway he walked through felt longer than it should. Every moment without noise gave his thoughts more space than he wanted to allow. And in that space, her words returned, not louder, just clearer. If you can play it properly tonight, in front of everyone. He didn't need to hear the rest. But something about her words wouldn't let him walk away. It wasn't the challenge itself, it wasn't even the laughter that followed. It was what the moment had uncovered, something he had spent years keeping controlled, contained, out of reach. Now it was there again, not fully, not completely, but enough to be felt, enough to be noticed. Days passed, then another. Daniel stayed consistent, predictable, quiet. He avoided the ballroom entirely, choosing longer routes, different schedules, anything that kept him from standing in front of that door again. But avoidance doesn't erase memory, it sharpens it. There were small moments, easy to miss, easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. His fingers tapping lightly against the handle of his cleaning cart, not randomly, but in rhythm, patterns forming without him realizing it. A sequence of notes his mind remembered even if he refused to play them. He would stop suddenly, as if catching himself, his hand going still before anyone else noticed. Another moment, he paused near a distant corridor, his head tilting slightly. For a second it sounded like music, faint, almost imagined, but there was no piano there, no source, just the echo of something his mind hadn't let go of. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to something that wasn't real but felt like it was. Have you ever tried to ignore something inside you, only to realize it keeps finding ways to come back, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to remind you it's still there? Because that's what this became, not a decision, not yet, just a quiet tension building beneath everything he did. At night, when his shift slowed and the building returned to silence, the pull became stronger, not visible, not obvious, but present. The hallway leading to the ballroom didn't change, but the way he looked at it did. There were moments where he would stop at the far end just for a second, his eyes fixed on the closed doors, not moving closer, not turning away immediately either, just standing there. Then he would shake it off, move on, continue working. But the distance between him and that piano was no longer just physical. It was something else now, something heavier. Because the question had changed. It wasn't about whether he could play. That answer already existed, buried in years he hadn't spoken about. The real question was something else entirely. What if he failed again? Not in the way people in that ballroom expected, not missing notes or losing rhythm. That kind of failure didn't matter to him. The real fear was deeper than that. What if he sat down and felt nothing? What if the connection that once defined everything he was didn't come back? What if the silence he carried for so long had already replaced it completely? That was the risk, not embarrassment, not judgment, something far more personal. And once that question takes hold, it doesn't leave easily. So tell me, if you were in his position, what would you do? Would you take the chance, knowing it could reopen something you've spent years trying to live without? Or would you protect yourself and walk away even if it meant never knowing what could have happened? Because for Daniel, the decision wasn't coming all at once. It was building, slowly, quietly, in moments no one else could see. And sooner or later, he would have to face it. The night before the gala didn't feel special to anyone else. The hotel moved through its usual rhythm, reservations confirmed, decorations finalized, staff briefed on timing and expectations. Everything was in place for another flawless evening. Another event that would begin, impress, and end without leaving anything behind. But for Daniel, it felt different. He finished his shift later than usual, not because there was more work, but because he had taken longer to complete what was already familiar. Slower steps, longer pauses, small delays that didn't make sense unless you knew what he was avoiding or what he was slowly moving toward. By the time the last corridor was cleared and the final light dimmed, the building had returned to silence. And once again, he found himself standing in front of the ballroom doors. This time he didn't walk past. His hand rested on the handle longer than it should have, not frozen, just waiting, as if some part of him was asking for a reason to turn back, but nothing came, no interruption, no distraction, just the quiet certainty that the moment had arrived whether he was ready or not. He pushed the door open. The room was empty, chairs arranged neatly, tables set for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. The grand piano stood exactly where it would be the next night, uncovered, prepared as if it already knew it would be the center of attention. Daniel walked toward it slowly, no hesitation in his steps this time, just a steady, controlled movement that carried something heavier beneath it. He sat down. Adjusting slightly on the bench, his eyes fixed on the keys. For a moment nothing happened. His hands rested in his lap, his breathing uneven though he tried to steady it. The silence around him felt louder than it should, pressing in from all sides. He lifted his hands, then stopped, lowered them again, closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through tension he couldn't fully release. Have you ever been right at the edge of something that matters and felt your body resist it, even when your mind knows you have to try? That moment where fear doesn't shout, it just holds you still. He tried again. This time his fingers reached the keys. The first note came out softer than he intended. Uncertain, he paused, his breath caught slightly, his shoulders tightening. For a second it felt like before, like that stage, that silence, that moment where everything had slipped away from him. His hands trembled just enough to remind him of what could happen. He stopped, pulled his hands back, looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else. What if it happens again? The thought didn't come as a voice, it was already there, waiting. But then something else followed, not louder, not stronger, just present. A memory. A quiet voice, feel it. His mother's words didn't come back all at once, just that one piece, simple, steady, enough to shift something inside him. His hands moved again, slower this time, more deliberate, not trying to be perfect, not trying to prove anything, just playing. And then, he didn't stop. The notes began to connect one into the next, forming something that wasn't flawless but real. There were imperfections, slight hesitations, a missed transition that he corrected without breaking the flow, but underneath it all there was something else, something that hadn't been there in years. Emotion. Not controlled the way it used to be, not shaped for an audience, just honest, raw in a way that couldn't be practiced. The music filled the empty ballroom, rising and falling with a weight that didn't need perfection to be understood. It wasn't about precision anymore, it was about meaning. And in that moment, something came back. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough for him to feel it again, enough to know it hadn't disappeared the way he feared it had. He played through the piece without stopping this time. When the final note settled into the silence, he didn't move right away. His hands remained on the keys, his breathing steady now, his expression quieter but clearer. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't avoiding the piano. He stood slowly, stepping back from it, his eyes lingering for just a second longer than before. There was no audience to react, no applause waiting, just silence. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was resolved. So let me ask you, if you finally found your way back to something you thought you lost forever, would you hold on to it? Or would you still be afraid it might disappear again? Because what happened next would change everything. The night of the gala arrived the way moments like this always do, on time, whether anyone feels ready or not. By early evening, the hotel had transformed, every surface polished to perfection, every detail checked, then checked again. The ballroom, once quiet and empty, now carried a low hum of anticipation. Staff moved quickly but carefully, adjusting centerpieces, aligning chairs, ensuring nothing felt out of place. Because tonight wasn't just another event, it was important. The kind of night where impressions mattered, where conversations could shift outcomes, where everything needed to go exactly as planned. Guests began to arrive in waves, expensive suits tailored to precision, dresses that caught the light with every step. Laughter returned to the room, softer at first, then growing as more people filled the space. Glasses clinked, voices overlapped. Names were exchanged, deals hinted at, reputations quietly reinforced. To most of them, it was just another evening in a long series of evenings exactly like this. Veronica stood near the center of it all, exactly where she belonged. Composed, confident, in control of every detail without appearing to try. She greeted guests with a measured warmth, her words precise, her attention sharp. But every so often, almost imperceptibly, her gaze shifted, not toward the crowd but toward the stage. The piano sat there uncovered, placed under a soft spotlight that made it impossible to ignore. She didn't mention it, not directly, but the memory of what she had said days earlier lingered just enough to keep her amused, a private joke in her mind, something that had already played out the moment she said it, because in her world people didn't cross lines like that. They didn't step into roles that didn't belong to them, and if they tried, it usually ended the way everyone expected. Still, there was something about the setup that held attention. The clock moved forward minute by minute, each second bringing the room closer to a moment no one had officially acknowledged. Conversations continued, but not as freely as before. There were pauses now, glances toward the stage, subtle shifts in posture as people began to notice what hadn't been there at the beginning of the night, a sense of waiting. Have you ever been in a room where something is about to happen, but no one wants to say it out loud, where the energy changes even if the surface looks the same? Near the back of the room, a small group leaned closer together, voices lowered just enough to stay contained. "Is the janitor really doing this?" one of them asked, half smiling, half curious. Another shrugged lightly. "I doubt it, probably just a joke that went too far." A third glanced toward the stage again, their expression less certain. "Then why is the piano set up like that?" The question didn't get an answer. Because no one actually knew. Backstage, or rather just beyond the visible edge of the room, Daniel stood alone. No uniform this time, no name tag, just a simple, clean suit that fit well enough to avoid attention but not enough to demand it. His hands rested at his sides, still but not relaxed. His breathing steady, though it took effort to keep it that way. He could hear the room, the conversations, the occasional laugh, the faint sound of glass against glass. It all felt distant, like something happening in another space entirely. What mattered was closer, much closer. His mind didn't race the way it once might have. The doubt was still there, but quieter now. Controlled, the memory of the night before sat just beneath the surface, steadying him in a way he hadn't expected. Not confidence, not certainty, just readiness. But even then, the question hadn't disappeared completely. What if it still goes wrong? It didn't stop him this time, it just existed alongside everything else. On the other side of the room, Veronica's attention shifted again. This time it stayed. The subtle movement near the edge of the stage caught her eye first, then the figure stepping forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Conversations began to fade, not all at once, slowly, like a wave pulling back, one voice stopping then another, heads turning one by one until the focus of the entire room aligned without anyone needing to direct it. Daniel stepped into the light. For a brief moment, no one reacted. not because they didn't recognize him but because they did, and the image didn't match what they expected. The same man they had seen cleaning floors now stood in a place reserved for something entirely different. Silence spread. Not forced, not polite, real silence, the kind that settles in when people don't know what's about to happen but know it matters. So tell me, if you were standing in that room watching him take that step, what would you be thinking? Would you still see a janitor, or would you start to question everything you assumed just days before? Because in that moment, there was no laughter. Only anticipation. He doesn't rush. Daniel walks the final steps toward the piano with a calm that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway. The room is already quiet, but somehow it becomes quieter. The kind of silence that feels heavier with each second, as if every person there is holding something in without realizing it. He reaches the bench, pauses for just a moment, then sits. No dramatic movement, no hesitation that anyone else can see, just a controlled stillness. His hands rest lightly on his lap, then slowly they rise. They hover above the keys. And nothing happens. A second passes, then another. The silence begins to stretch, pulling tight across the room. You can feel it now, not just hear it. The kind of tension that makes people shift slightly in their seats, that makes them aware of their own breathing. Somewhere in the crowd, someone exhales a little too loudly, then immediately stills again. If you're still watching, this is why. Because moments like this don't come often. The space between action and outcome, the exact point where everything could still go either way. Daniel's fingers lower just slightly, then stop again. His breath catches, almost unnoticeable, and for a fraction of a second the past is there, that stage, that silence, that moment where everything once fell apart. What if it happens again? The question is there, but this time it doesn't take control. His fingers press down. The first note enters the room quietly. Soft. Not perfect. Human. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't try to prove anything, it simply exists, and for a brief moment nothing changes. Some people are still waiting for the mistake, still expecting the moment to collapse into something they can laugh at, something they can dismiss. Then the second note follows. And the third. And suddenly the space begins to shift. The melody forms, not hesitantly anymore, but with intention. The slight imperfection of that first note doesn't disappear, it becomes part of something larger, something real. And as the piece unfolds, something unmistakable begins to take hold. He's not guessing. He's not trying. He knows exactly what he's doing. The music of Frédéric Chopin fills the ballroom, not as background, not as decoration, but as presence. Strong, controlled, deep. His fingers move with a precision that doesn't feel forced, each note landing with clarity, each transition flowing into the next without effort. It's not just correct, it's alive. Close enough you'd see it in his hands, the way they move without hesitation now. The way years of discipline return not as memory but as instinct. Faster passages glide effortlessly, slower ones held just long enough to carry weight, every detail placed exactly where it needs to be. And the room begins to change. At first it's subtle. A smirk that doesn't quite hold, a raised eyebrow lowering slowly, someone leaning forward just a little as if trying to understand what they're hearing. The quiet confidence that once filled the room begins to fade, replaced by something less certain. Confusion. Because this isn't what they expected. The laughter from days ago doesn't fit here anymore. As the music continues, that confusion shifts again, the realization comes slowly, then all at once. This isn't a coincidence, this isn't luck, this is something else entirely, something they didn't take the time to recognize before. And then, it spreads without permission, without announcement. You see it in the stillness of the audience, in the way no one moves, no one speaks, the way attention sharpens, focusing completely on the man they had overlooked. Somewhere in the room, someone's expression softens, another person's eyes lower as if suddenly aware of something they hadn't considered before, and then, quietly, someone feels it, not just hears it, feels it. Because the music isn't just sound anymore. It's something deeper. Veronica is no longer smiling. At some point, no one can say exactly when, it faded, replaced by something else. Her posture shifts slightly, almost unconsciously. Her eyes narrow at first, then widen just enough to reveal what she's beginning to understand. This wasn't supposed to happen, not like this, not at this level, not from him. But there's no denying it now. She isn't watching a joke unfold. She's witnessing something real. And as the piece reaches deeper into itself, Daniel changes with it, not physically, not in a way that's obvious at first glance, but inside something opens. The control remains, the precision holds, but beneath it, emotion rises. And it shows. Not in exaggerated movement, not in visible strain, but in the way he plays, in the slight weight behind certain notes, in the way he lingers just a fraction longer than expected, in the way the music begins to carry something beyond technique. Memories surface, not as clear images but as fragments woven into the sound. A small apartment, a quiet voice telling him to feel it, long nights of practice, a stage filled with light, applause that once meant everything. And then loss. The kind that doesn't leave when the moment passes, the kind that changes everything that comes after it. It's all there now, not spoken, not explained, just present. Have you ever heard something that made you stop thinking completely? That pulled you out of where you were and placed you somewhere else entirely. That made you feel something you didn't expect, something you couldn't easily explain. Because that's what this becomes. Not a performance. A release. Years of silence, of restraint, of everything left unsaid, finding its way into something that can finally be heard. This wasn't just music, it was everything he lost finally being heard. The final section approaches and you can feel it, not because the tempo changes dramatically but because the weight behind it shifts. There's resolution here, not perfect, not complete, but enough. His hands move with certainty now, no trace of hesitation left. Each note lands exactly where it needs to, carrying everything that came before it. The room holds steady, no one daring to break the moment. And then the final note. It doesn't end abruptly, it lingers, softly, echoing just long enough to remind everyone that it was real, that it happened. And then silence. Not the same silence as before, this one is different, full, heavy in a way that doesn't feel uncomfortable but meaningful. No one moves, no one speaks, it lasts longer than expected, stretching just enough to let everything settle. And then, one person stands. Then another. And another. Until the entire room rises almost at once, the sound of applause breaking through the silence with a force that fills every corner of the space. Not polite, not measured, real, loud, uncontrolled, the kind of response that doesn't need to be explained. A standing ovation. The music had ended, but the energy in the room lingered. Heart still racing, breath still caught in chests, eyes still wide with disbelief. The standing ovation continued, echoing off the walls as if the room itself refused to let the moment fade. Daniel remained seated at the piano for a few seconds longer, hands lightly resting on the keys, eyes closed, not in pride, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had just passed. Then footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate, Veronica, her heels no longer clicked with confidence, they tapped with uncertainty. She stopped just a few feet away, eyes searching his, expecting what? Admiration, gratitude, perhaps an apology. Instead, her expression softened. The edge she had carried for years, the edge that made her untouchable, wavered. And then she whispered, barely audible above the lingering applause. "I saw you play years ago." For a heartbeat, Daniel didn't respond. The room seemed to still even more, as if time itself was holding its breath. She stepped closer, lowering her voice further, almost as if sharing a secret only he could hear. "I meant what I said," she admitted, a trace of vulnerability beneath her usual poise. Daniel's gaze remained steady, calm, unshaken. His fingers lightly tapped the keys once, not to play but to punctuate, and then softly he spoke. "I didn't play for you." A hush fell over the crowd. The realization landed slowly. This performance had never been for recognition, for validation, or for someone else's approval. It had been for him, for the years of silence, loss, and everything buried deep inside. Then almost casually he stood, adjusted his jacket, paused once, letting the applause wash over him, not needing it, not clinging to it, and without a word he stepped away from the spotlight. The crowd was still on its feet, mesmerized, unsure whether to cheer louder or simply stay silent, caught between awe and respect. A former mentor, someone who had quietly observed from the back of the room, stepped forward. Recognition flashed across their face, pride, surprise, and relief all mingled in one fleeting expression. But Daniel didn't stop. He didn't turn. He walked away. Not away from music, not away from life, but away from expectation, away from judgment, away from the roles others tried to force upon him. Tonight he had reclaimed everything that truly mattered. And in that quiet exit, the room understood, sometimes the most powerful triumph isn't in applause. It's in walking away having finally been heard. Before we continue with the next part of the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sometimes the world forgets greatness. It moves on too quickly, distracted by the next story, the next face, the next performance. And yet greatness doesn't disappear, it waits, quietly, patiently, ready to remind us of what was always there, even when we thought it was lost. For Daniel, the applause wasn't the point. The recognition wasn't the goal. What mattered was reclaiming what had been taken from him, not by anyone else but by life itself. That silent, painful gap in his story finally filled by his own hands, his own choices, his own courage. And as the lights dim and the room slowly returns to ordinary, the question remains for all of us. What would you have done in his place? Would you step forward when fear still whispers in your ear, or would you let it pass, hidden in quiet regret? And one more, was Veronica wrong, or did she unknowingly give him a second chance at something he had thought was gone forever? Think about it, reflect, and let us know in the comments, because stories like this don't just end at the final note, they live on in the questions they leave behind.